Welcome listeners, viewers and online guests to this, our next session in our series of Safe to Trade conversations. I'm your host Kelvin Wood and I'm also the certification body manager at Shield Safety. This month we continue our conversation series, providing you with lots of insight and data and everything you need to know about Safe to Trade. We hope that you enjoy today's session. And we'd like to thank you for joining us and those who are joining us live in this virtual live stream. After our short conversations today, we will have the opportunity for some questions and hopefully some good answers as well. So if you do have a question spring to mind, please just type your question in the comments box and we'll field as many as possible to our guests today and to myself, and hopefully we will answer them to your satisfaction. So speaking of guests, today, I am joined by a very special guest. It's Sterling Crew, the Strategic Advisor to Shield Safety, a certification body of Safe to Trade. So I'd like to welcome Sterling to the stage. Good morning, Sterling.
Morning, Kelvin. Good morning, everybody.
Thank you for joining us today. We're really pleased to have you again on these sessions. I know this is your second or third session now in our calendar of conversations. So thank you for your time. For the benefit of those viewers, listeners who have not met you before, Sterling, would you mind introducing yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself and your career.
Yeah, sure. So I've been in the food sector for over 40 years now. And I started off as an environmental health practitioner, and then I went into private practice, and I've worked for people like Marks and Spencer and Tesco and Coca-Cola, so some of the big brands. And I've also worked in food manufacturing as well, Kelvin's. And so it gives you quite a good view of the regulatory sphere, the food supply chain, and legislation. So hopefully I'll be sharing my experience. And currently I'm president of the Institute of Food Science and Technology. Perhaps more importantly for today, I'm also chair of the Food Authenticity Network, and more of that later. That was set up by the government following the horse meat scandal, and I do some advisory work for a number of bodies. I'm a trustee of the CIH as well, that I know you're a member as well, Kelvin.
Indeed. That's a lot more than I could squeeze into a slide. So thank you very much for going through all of that, Sterling. So let's get on to today's topic and introduce what we're going to talk about today. So this month is a session really designed at both food business operators, but also at general consumers themselves. We wish to shine a spotlight on food fraud and illicit food from a subject matter area, but also from a safe to trade perspective as well. Yeah. So with that being said, I guess the first question would be for people who've landed from another planet, what do we mean by food fraud, Sterling? Could you just kind of describe it a little bit to the listeners?
Yeah, so food fraud in its simplest way, and you'll also hear people use the word authenticity as well as fraud, is when a food supplier deliberately attempts to deceive their customer about the quality or the content of the food. And Kelvin, I'd say, look, this isn't new. You're quite right. It's a very hot subject for hospitality and manufacturing. Whether you're a big business or a small business, it's really important. But this has been going back since recorded history. So we know that it was happening in Egyptian times. And in fact, in Roman times, we can see it being used in olive oil, of all things, which we might talk about today, where the Romans were adulterating grades of olive oil so that they could charge more for them. So this practice has been going on since, I think, humans evolved through the recorded history, and we've still got it now, and it still resonates with some of the issues that we've always had.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite stories with regard to food fraud is the saying, "I've been sent to Coventry," which is where the master bakers used to get sent to retrain when they were caught putting stones and rocks in the flour to bulk it out, which is obviously a very old-fashioned form of food fraud. So yeah, it's crept into the vernacular there.
Absolutely, and I think even baker's dozen comes from that. A baker's dozen is really 13, not 12. And it was because they were shorting people on bread, and it was a way of assuring that they gave the exact amount they should do rather than end up being prosecuted.
Yeah. So what are some of the other kind of stories around food fraud that people might be aware of? You mentioned olive oil there. What are the other things that have kind of made the media over recent years?
Well, I suppose the biggest story that we've had in the last decade or so, in 2013, was the horse meat scandal. And I think that brought a lot of focus onto food fraud. It has always been there, but I think it had such a massive impact. Whereas, you know, people are substituting horse meat instead of selling beef, and we could have a beef burger and it's likely to have horse in it. But to me, it's not just the fact that you're defrauding your customer, but the fact it's outside the normal food safety chain. So these are criminals doing this, obviously. They're attempting to deceive. And these people aren't thinking about food safety. You know, they don't employ food technologists or environmental health practitioners to make sure the food is safe and legal. And so we don't know how safe that food is and how many people got injured by it or even killed by it. We don't know how many tons was ever sold, although it's not a lot. And although we talk about it in the UK, it was a European-wide affair. As you can imagine, it's a European network. And I suppose that's the one that people most quote to me. If you start talking about food fraud, it normally starts about the horse meat scandal. But a lot of things we'll talk about later, all the ways of stopping it, came out of that horse meat scandal. It was such a big issue. And we had the Elliott report, as you know, that came out of it, that gave us some good tips on making our system a lot more robust.
Absolutely. Food fraud is such a large phrase in terms of a catch-all, but can you tell us a little bit about maybe the different types of food fraud, or break it down a little bit into some of the specific offences maybe?
Yeah, so there is not a specific offence for food fraud in the Food Safety Act, although obviously you have to sell safe food, but there is a bit in the Act that people don't often know about, which is the quality, nature and substance. So if you sell something that is not the quality, nature or substance, so it could be like, I don't know, you're selling an egg as a British Lion egg, but it's not a British Lion egg, then you're obviously attempting to deceive somebody. Or if you're selling oil that comes from Italy and, you know, it doesn't, then that's nature substance. And there's also something in the Food Safety Act about how you market food. So there is a legal obligation that if you get it wrong, you will be prosecuted.
Yeah. Can food fraud ever be accidental, or does it always require the guilty mind, so to speak, and the intention to deceive?
Yeah, that is the intention to deceive, because you might not intentionally sell food which is not what it should be, and that is it's still an offence, but it's not fraud in the sense you didn't commit fraud, you were misled. And I think that's a problem for a lot of people in restaurants and food manufacturers. Is it's, you know, within their own boundaries they can control what goes on, and there is a certain trust you have to put in your suppliers, and the job for people is to, you know, be assured that you can trust, and you've got the steps in place to make sure you can trust what's coming in through your door. You know, whether it's a factory or a restaurant, big or small business, how do you trust the food that you're buying? And then we'll probably talk about what happens about your own staff. And you talked about types, so there's adulteration, which is probably the most common type, is where you use something that shouldn't be in there to increase the price. And we talked about olive oil. That's probably the biggest thing that's being adulterated. Vegetable oil, generally, not just olive oil. And whether you're using it in a factory again, and I stress in a restaurant, everybody uses vegetable oil in one form or another. Very few businesses don't. And that is an area that we've seen lots of fraud in, probably the highest area by monetary value. And it's largely because, you know, if you're buying Italian olive oil, extra virgin olive oil, I'll pay for that because of the quality and the provenance. Actually, there's more Italian olive oil being sold on the market than they can actually grow. There's a massive amount that is, you know, they can't meet the demand, and a lot of it comes from North America, North Africa, or Spain, and you're defrauding the consumer, obviously.
Absolutely. And sticking with the Mediterranean diet, I believe it's just as much a problem in Spain with balsamic vinegar claims and substitutions of different wines and lesser quality and the provenance there. So yeah, it's a big issue. You mentioned about adulteration, about putting things in the food that shouldn't be in there, or that the consumers are not made aware of. Are we talking like from a product substitution perspective of maybe using a cheaper ingredient there?
Yeah, so you can use cheaper ingredients. You can see that really in honey. So if you looked at the big areas for food fraud, so if you're thinking, well, where is it likely to be found? You'll see it in vegetable oils, you'll see it in milk, you'll see it in spices, because you can't determine if it's for fraud or not. You'll see it in alcohol, saffron, and honey is a big one as well. And where the substitution is, as you can imagine, honey comes from bees, and you're buying that. That's what you're buying, is the quality of the bees. And a lot of people put sugar in, quite a substantial amount. And chemically, it's very difficult to tell the difference between, what is glucose from a chemical reaction and what is glucose made by a bee. And so testing is really important. If you want to differentiate them, it's not like you could buy honey at home and think, oh, this tastes like it's had sugar in it. You wouldn't be able to do that. And testing, you'd say, oh, I can see it's got glucose in, but even that wouldn't give you a clue where it's come from. So there's a very sophisticated testing system to look at the profiles of different honey, so you can identify where they've come from and how much is perhaps adulterated. So that's a substitution, replacing an expensive ingredient with a cheaper ingredient.
Yeah, and also as well, I guess there's the addition side of adulteration as well. So adding things in to the food, whether you want to kind of increase the weight of the product. You mentioned saffron earlier. I understand that in some areas saffron's more valuable than gold. So if you're selling those kind of products, you want to bulk out the weight, make more money, but actually there's not as much saffron in the product there. So it's interesting when you think about those kind of different types of adulteration.
Can I give you a different view then? So why am I interested in food fraud when I'm a food safety person? Really, that's what my career has been. Is because a lot of food fraud cases actually have food safety implications behind them.
Yeah.
And so that's my interest. And when you talk about adulteration, and probably one of the most famous cases is when baby milk, and you think of the high risk group of people who are drinking that, was being exported into China, and the milk, you pay for the milk by the amount of the protein that's in it. And what the fraudsters thought is, if we could use melanin into that milk that we're sending, it will make the test look like there's a lot of protein in there when there's not. So the food fraudsters were thinking, oh, we can charge more because the customer will think there's protein in it when there's not so much. And of course, the problem is that melanin in certain quantities is highly toxic. And we saw in China, I think there were 15 baby deaths that we know of, and that hundreds of thousands of babies were affected. And I think that was a bit of underreporting, to be honest with you, because I don't think the country wanted to say how big it was. And so you can see somebody who's committing fraud, with a little bit of scientific knowledge, thinks, oh, I can get more money, but not with enough knowledge to think I'm going to end up killing people. So you had deaths, you had a lack of confidence in the system. So the government had an issue that they're there to protect people, and the food system within China took a huge knock. And I think also the 4 people who were caught and convicted were all executed. So there's some
goodness.
Yeah, so they take it very, very seriously. So there is that link between I'm just committing fraud to take money, and if you don't know what you're doing, crikey, there are some serious health consequences.
Yeah. So in terms of the effects of food fraud, you've just mentioned from an environmental health perspective, as a public health perspective, we're interested in things that would make the consumers unwell from consumption, which you just mentioned. And I understand as well that, some of these additions are pharmaceutical ingredients and antibiotics freely available on the internet that people can just purchase and stick in the food as well. So there's all sorts of unknown health effects that may come as a result of food fraud.
And not just health effects. Obviously, they're the ones that I'm motivated by more than anything else. But it's a huge economic issue and a social issue. Yeah. So it's interesting. The FSA did a study saying, well, how much is this really costing the country economically? So we all know the safety implications, and it turns out that somewhere between, in the UK alone, it's costing the country, the food sector, somewhere between 268 million and 1.4 billion pounds. I know that seems a big scope, but it's how you measure it. But by anybody's terms, that's a lot of money that we're losing to the economy. And more importantly, you know, honest traders out there, food business operators who are doing the job properly, are being undercut unfairly. And what surprised me is a recent figure that comes out that, you know, if you think you might drive a car or not drive a car, you might own a house or not own a house, they're your choices, but you don't have choices about food. Everybody eats. That's the one thing we can say in this country, what unites us. You know, we all drink and we all eat. We don't have a choice. And it costs us, it's been estimated, the public, £58 a year just from food fraud. And that's quite a significant amount of money for someone, you know, when you think of what that money could have been spent on, it really is quite disturbing. So it's an economic crime, as well as being a food safety crime. And certainly in kind of developing countries, you're undermining the developing countries because they're not gathering taxes. And so they're undermining their health system and their social system. So it is a global problem, as one as that affects us locally in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, we've mentioned health, we've mentioned economic. There's also the ethical side of food fraud as well. About, you mentioned overseas, such as exploitation of workers. I understand from some reading as well, things like avocados, which are so expensive and so in demand, literal gangs of thugs will take ownership of those farms and displace the farmers just to make the money from those products. So, you know, the criminal element is much more beyond just the financial and the health sides of food fraud. There's some very dangerous underworld activity that goes on.
Yeah, so I know a forensic accountant, and her and her team were looking at, so a commission to look at the criminality. And actually, she was saying to me, look, Sterling, if you're criminally minded, don't go into drugs. Because drugs, the consequences of getting caught, you know, there's big sentences. The police are all over it. There's lots of investigations. And, you know, it's a dangerous area to be in. And it's not as profitable as food fraud. If you want to make money and you're a criminal, food fraud is a great place to go, because you can make as much money from food fraud as you can from narcotics. You can, there aren't so many police going out there looking for it. And also the consequences of getting caught aren't like you're going to be locked up for life. You know, the fines and sentences are relatively small. And it was interesting you mentioned avocados, because they're what we call blood avocados. And I was over in Mexico recently, and the drug cartels are moving out of drugs, are moving into food and committing fraud in food, where they're growing their own avocados, passing them off as other types of avocados. And you can see if a cartel is thinking, well, I'm moving out of narcotics into food fraud, there's a reason for that. And as you know, organized crime is involved in this, not just local criminals. It is, and that's why we had the food crime unit in the Food Standards Agency and Food Standards Scotland, who do such a good job looking for that level of organized criminality.
I mean, you may have just answered my next question in terms of why do people commit food crime. So you've said it's obviously there's the financial gain that comes from it, but the lesser offences, if you are caught, as compared to other illegal activities like drugs. But are there any other reasons why individuals, organised crime exists for food fraud?
Yeah, because it's counterfeiting. So if you're in crime and you're counterfeiting goods, like you might have, we've seen recently with the World Cup, all those counterfeited England shirts that were going out there. So counterfeiting is a normal practice in criminality, and people counterfeit food. So you can just buy a food and it looks like you've bought, I don't know, some type of tomato soup, and it's your favorite brand, but somebody else thinks, well, I can make it cheaper because I don't have the same ethical approach to safety. And so counterfeiting is not unusual, and misrepresenting as well. So I work for the British Line Egg Scheme. It's one of the most successful food safety schemes that there is, not just in this country, but in the world, and acknowledged by that. And the Food Standards Agency turn around and say, look, if you eat British Lion eggs and you're a vulnerable person, you're safe. You can have runny eggs. There's no salmonella in it. It's got this code of practice behind it. And so you imagine there's a premium on that. The people who supply those eggs have to pay for all the kind of audits and tests and all the other things. But in Ireland recently, there was someone misrepresenting. It was a farmer who had eggs, simply duplicated the British Lion mark and was stamping all his eggs British Lion and then exporting to them. So consumers are thinking, I want to buy an egg that's hasn't got salmonella in it. Oh, I'll get my British Lion egg. And then if a vulnerable person does that, you don't know where it's come from. You don't know the farmer's been vaccinating his flock, or he's tested his flock, what his standards are, what he's been feeding the birds. And so that is misrepresenting as, oh, look, here's a British Lion egg. And the consequences could be, safety issues. And if a vulnerable person eats it, they could die. Look, if you or I get salmonella, you know how serious it is for a healthy person. So there is that aspect as well, as people are trying to misrepresent because there's a price differential. And that's where you see fraud, where there's a price differential in the marketplace. And if you can misrepresent this as this, then you can make, you're talking about millions of pounds. It's not like, oh, let's make an extra £100. It's an industry.
Absolutely. And I guess there's the other aspects of consumer requirements that we've not really touched on yet. So things like misrepresenting food as being suitable for certain religious groups or diets, saying something is kosher, halal, when it's not. Obviously, that's such a massive ethical issue. And then environmental issues as well of, fish stocks in certain waters that we might be passing off as a different fish and affecting the environmental balance. So there's a huge gamut of different effects of food fraud, isn't there?
Yeah, and I think you're right. That's a good one to pick on, religious, because I think this is all about consumer choice. I mean, the consumers just want to make a choice that I know this food is safe. I know it's the quality, the provenance is what I want. The welfare standards. So the eggs, again, it's about you getting welfare standards. And it's a good point to pick up on halal. Last year in Malaysia, there's a huge, big price difference between halal meat and normal meat, because you have to pay for it to go through a certain process and certain assurances, quite rightly. And there they were selling off meat that wasn't halal, because it's a big Muslim market. It is, if you're a Muslim, a strict Muslim, you have to eat halal. It's not a choice for you. It's part of who you are. And they were exploiting that difference. And we've seen that elsewhere. And so, certain religious groups, Jewish groups are like that as well with kosher food. There is that price differential, and people are always looking to exploit it. And we talked about the food, the safety aspect and the financial aspect. But I think if you're a very religious person, for instance, that's really important to you. And also, I think with vegans, now, if people make a choice about a vegan diet and find out that actually, there are ingredients in there that aren't vegan or animal derived, you could say, well, look, it's not doing any harm. It's not a safety issue. In fact, it's a bit cheaper to use. But to that person with their moral position, it is offensive. And I think that is, as you say, a really big issue with food fraud, people exploiting people's belief systems.
Absolutely. So we've talked about food fraud in terms of defining it, providing a few examples, explaining what goes on out there in the world. So now we've put the fear of death into some food business operators. What are some of the steps that food businesses can do to protect themselves from food fraud?
Well, the fantastic news is that since we've had the horse meat scandal, is we have a far, far more robust food supply chain. So we do have some issues in the UK on our ports. So I don't think we have enough inspectors there. And so we do see a lot of food coming in there that shouldn't be coming in the country. And the FSA has put out warnings on that. There are certain food types they're concerned about. But it's really about, if you want to take steps, is to, first of all, acknowledge that it's an issue. You can go into any food business and talk about food safety, and people will immediately engage with it. Of course, food safety, and all food businesses are trying to do the right thing. But what their problem is that if you've got things like HACCP in the bigger companies or food safety management systems. It's all about trying to do the right thing. So it's all good players working hard. As you know, the people in our sector work hard every day to make food safe. Sometimes it doesn't work, but it doesn't work because of ignorance, not because of intent. And I think if you're that type of person trying to do right or not trying to do wrong, your culture is not twigged. Because what you need to do in food fraud is think like a criminal. So it's almost like that's the biggest thing, I think, is people in the industry have to think like criminals. Don't think like good people trying to do good things, but try to think, if I was a criminal, how would I commit food fraud in the company, either by what's coming into my restaurant or what people might do within my restaurant or food factory for fraud. So a good example might be, so people always think, oh, it's a big food manufacturing issue, but it's not. It's a small issue. So there was a restaurant last year, and what they thought they would do is put almonds in their curries because it's a high quality ingredient. And if you've got almonds in, they pay a bit more because, it's a nicer flavor. But what they did is this is just one restaurant, substituted peanuts. So they were
remember this use case.
Yeah. So there you think, well, I'm just going to save a bit of money. So they're not thinking like criminals. Well, they are thinking like criminals, but didn't accept the consequences. And somebody died. They went in there, asked, look, I'm allergic to peanuts. Do you have peanuts, a type of legume, a groundnut? And they said, no, we only use almonds. And in fact, it was on their menus. So the guy, you could argue, was being pernickety. Trading Standards actually had turned up a couple of months before and pointed out the fact, why have you got peanuts on site when it's not on your menu? And unfortunately, the guy died straight away. And so what somebody probably thought was a petty fraud, I'm just making a bit of extra money here, actually turned out to be a food safety issue. And he killed somebody. And so that's the thing to think of if you're in the food business, is start to think like a criminal. And try to take the steps that can prevent that or mitigate it. You can't completely eliminate it, as we've seen with olive oil, and it was happening 2,000 years ago, and it's still happening today. But you can mitigate it and protect your business and your customers.
Yeah, and you mentioned obviously HACCP earlier as something that, from a food safety perspective, we're all over. We know it's a legal requirement to have documented systems. So I guess the extension to food fraud would be vulnerability assessments and the VASP process. Yeah. How would that work as a manufacturer or a food business operator kind of conducting a vulnerability assessment on your supply chain?
Well, it's another acronym. I think it took me years to pronounce HACCP properly. And now VASP's come out of the blue. And sometimes I'm not pro acronym because it tends to be a barrier between people.
Yeah,
it's just another list. And if you say HACCP, people probably know what it is but can't tell you what it is. But VASP is a vulnerability assessment, and it's very similar to HACCP. It's the same principles as HACCP, and it's a recognized way that you can get your organization accredited. So if you wanted to go accreditation through the Safe to Trade scheme, if you're looking for accreditation, or GFSI or BRCG, these things are you can get them accredited by independent third parties. And really, I think it's common sense put down in paper. A lot of people will read it and say, well, that seems pretty obvious. But sometimes it's the obvious things that people don't do. So you carry out, as it says, like HACCP, it's a risk management system about how do you identify hazards and manage the risk, what the control points, the really important areas you need to focus on. And VASP does that, but does it with thinking like a criminal. How am I going to defraud this company? And so you get a team together to do the identify hazards and do the risk assessments. That team might look a bit different. Now, normally HACCP's got operational teams and technical teams, but actually the VASP teams have got personnel in there as well. Is there anyone in our organization that might be more likely to commit fraud than someone else, or has got a history of it? You might get security involved. So the team looks a bit different and the agenda's a bit different, but actually what you do around the table is very similar. Is about identifying the hazards, carrying out a risk assessment, identify the really critical areas. Where do you need to put your effort into, and what areas are a bit present a less risk? So it's all about focusing your resources and then making sure you've got controls in place to make sure that you're either testing or you're checking, to make sure that an example might be even security cameras. So in HACCP, you probably wouldn't use security cameras so much, thinking some people do for food safety. But when you start talking about fraud, then it becomes really important about how you're gathering information and what people are doing within the company. So I recommend it as a tool. It can be a bit wordy, but there's a PAS document as well, which is a public available system. For me, though, if I was just the ordinary person, I'd go to the Food Standards Agency site, and they have a tool for how to identify food fraud and what to do. So you don't have to pay for it, it's free. There's also the Food and Drink Federation, the FDF, if you put that into Google. They've got it's almost a simple 5-step process, one that I always use, which is really basic. Don't forget, guys, this is what you need to do. And here's a checklist. Just check you're doing these things. And nothing on that list will be unfamiliar to the smallest of businesses to the very largest corporations.
Yeah, indeed. You mentioned, as we were going through that VASA process and control measures, about testing regimes. Now, you think of large manufacturing plants doing species testing for types of meat, types of fish, putting things through microscopy and mass spectrometers. From a small independent food business operator, a small restaurant, coffee shop, obviously they're not going to do anything like that. What can small businesses do that kind of fall within this realm? That, is it just a matter of having good supply networks and purchasing controls?
That's a really good point. It's horses for courses.
Yeah.
Not me. Go back to the horse.
No pun intended.
But if you're a big manufacturer, you do lots of testing. And one of the requirements from the Elliott Review is FIN, which is an organization which brings together all the testing from the big manufacturers and analyzes it and looks for trends. So it's a very important part of the food supplier global network. And sometimes small manufacturers benefit from that. If the big people are doing a lot of testing of their ingredients, well, they won't know if there's a chemical contaminant in there. Like if you were selling crisps in 2000 and they contain chili, you wouldn't know as a retailer or a little small shop, oh, there's Sudan 1 in here. You're not going to analyze that. But the big manufacturers are, and they will be telling you there's a problem in the supply chain. So you do get a bit of a halo effect. But there are simple things that you should do and must do. And most people do it anyway, which is look in your own business. Have I got a chef doing something a bit silly and a bit crazy? And look outside what comes in through your door. And if you're small, you can't know, but there are simple things you can do. Try to use regular, reputable suppliers. Somebody turns up at your back door with a load of meat saying, I've got this at half price, and it's an incredible price, then it might be too good to be true. And we've seen that here locally. We had a prosecution here just near me in Bath, where people were getting unfit meat, taking it to the local car wash and cutting it up in the car wash and repacking it and selling it. And you can imagine them going around to restaurants and say, look, I've got this fantastic price lamb here. It's half the price you'll get it from you. So there is that risk, is that something could be too good to be true. Don't chop and change your suppliers all the time on price, because, when you build up a history with somebody, you've got that assurance. And, look at the packaging that it comes in as well. Has it got the right certification on it, or sources, and what country it's come from? So the packaging can obviously tell you about what the product is. Sometimes fraudsters forget to do the packaging. So that's really important. They're those simple things. Buy from reputable suppliers. There is a difference between quality and price. Price is the cheapest. Quality is the one that gives you the best all-round value. And so I always think it's better not to put your business at risk, to save a bit of money, and to go reputable. But having said that, you and I both know what a state the hospitalities industry is in. I mean, it is low food inflation, costs have gone up, especially raw materials, power costs have gone up, all because of the war in the Ukraine. And so a lot of people are really on their uppers and struggling. So it's always a temptation. Hey, that I can get, I can't get cheaper electricity, but I can get maybe a cheaper supplier. So just saying, be wary. I can understand why you would do it. Just be wary.
And with the opportunity being there, and the financial pressure maybe to undertake such activity, I guess, and following on from horse meat, I guess this has just massively hit the consumer and eroded trust in the food industry. So in terms of the consumer perspective, is there anything a consumer should be doing to protect themselves from food fraud, or things to be aware of? If my mum's going out shopping, should she have this in mind?
Yeah, like I think a lot of it is where you buy it. It's like you could do an analogy with those England shirts. I think the genuine shirt cost about 90 quid, which seems a lot of money. But the other shirts you can't tell the difference of were like 12 quid. But you're not going to find those 12 quid shirts in Tesco's or Marks and Spencer, the fruit forward ones, but you might on a marketplace. So, you just have to be careful where you shop and be aware that some environments you might find fraudsters in, and others you might not. And it's about price, and has it been labeled, and is something obviously not what it seems to be.
I think you used the phrase before, if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. Yeah.
I believe everybody that bought a 15 quid England shirt knew that it was counterfeit. I don't believe anyone in their right mind could see, well, here's I think it was Nike who do the official shirt, and look, here's the Nike shirt, but look, it's 90 quid over here, but look, wow, it's 15 quid here. People know it. And you could say, well, is it a victimless crime because you're letting poor people buy stuff they couldn't get elsewhere? But the thing to bear in mind is you are feeding a criminal outfit, all that goes with criminality. So it's not a victimless crime always.
Yeah. Well, kind of let's bring it back to Safe to Trade. We are here as representatives of the scheme, and myself of the certification body for Safe to Trade. What is Safe to Trade doing as a voluntary third-party assurance scheme regarding food fraud? You mentioned earlier that it's quite interesting for environmental health professionals to be considering food fraud when traditionally it's more of a trading standards matter. So how does it fit in with Safe to Trade?
Well, first of all, for those who don't know Safe to Trade, and I sit on its governance board and technical board, I think it's one of the most innovative things that I've seen in hospitality in 40 years. And I'm not exaggerating. I think one of the biggest things we saw in manufacturing is third-party accreditation and standards coming in from retailers and standards coming in from the GFSI, proper standards, and they're being checked and audited. So a retailer will check their suppliers against the standard. BRCGS, organizations like that can check against their standards, and it gives the consumer confidence, and it gives the manufacturer confidence and the customer confidence. And I think Safe to Trade's standard is offering a similar thing for hospitality. And what I like about it is, as I say, it is accredited. So it's not just a standard. Somebody gets the ticket, or a tick box, I think it is, on the window, if they meet the standard. And the standard, I think, is split into two parts. This is what you have to do. This is the regulations. But it also gives a good idea about best practice, which you can choose. And here it is, food fraud is mentioned in the standard.
It is, yeah. It's its own clause, and it's in the food standards kind of section of Safe to Trade, which is, again, traditionally something more interrogated by trading standards officers. So these things that are so important to the consumer for protecting them from deception is evaluated as part of Safe to Trade. We're not just here to look at structure, hygiene, and confidence in management.
And as I say, I think that's largely also because of the food safety element.
Yeah.
Because and I think from what I remember, the requirement is, well, you must do this, is that you can't willingly engage in food fraud activities. So it's very simple and very right. And then if one of our people who are accredited is committing food fraud, then they obviously can't be in the standard, and they can't be in the scheme. And then there's the best practice. So you won't find 3 pages of this is VASAP, this is PASS, you have to do this and that. It is a more descriptive about, you've got to be aware of food fraud. So if you went into a restaurant, and it's to help people, as you know, if you go into a restaurant and say, well, do you think food fraud can impact your business? If the person says, well, I hadn't thought about it, it's a conversation starter. And then it gives, it's a signposting to things like the FSA Code of Practice and FSS and other people who I've mentioned who can help you. So yes, it is in the standard, and rightly so, I think.
And in terms of evaluating as part of the audit process for Safe to Trade, the auditors are trained to, look through menus, look through food specifications, and these claims that are being made around provenance or weight or brand even. That is what we check with the food, as much as we would check the date labeling, temperature control, etc. We are interrogating what is being presented to the consumers on the menu to make sure that's what they're receiving.
Yeah, and I think that's why I'm such a fan of Safe to Trade. It's actually consumer led. People think it's something to do with the hospitality industry, but the first point is enabling consumers to make better choices, to be able to eat at places that have got that extra level of assurance, so they can make the choice. And it does protect public health. That's what it's about: food safety and health and safety. But to me, it means that it's also protecting businesses, because I've yet to go into a business that wants to do the wrong thing and get prosecuted. Never. And so the businesses, it's far better that a Safe to Trade auditor comes in and says, well, if I was looking at food fraud, be careful of this, this, and this, and protect yourself, rather than, you find out later that you committed a massive faux pas. A good one for me is quite a significant restaurant chain that I used to go to. I'm a great seafood lover. Was doing like a lobster soup, and some trading standards people came in and found out there was hardly any lobster in it. It was a minimal amount of lobster, almost like a cursory, let's put a little squirt of lobster in it. But what they were selling was fish soup. But the price between lobster soup and fish soup, and I don't fancy a fish. I love a little lobster soup. And that was people in the restaurants themselves sitting there thinking, well, I'm just going to use less of this ingredient, more of that ingredient, to a point where you're misleading the customer. And then, if it was in the Safe to Trade scheme, someone might pick that up and say, look, you've got to be careful here. This is illegal, and you're misleading customers, and you open yourself to a regulatory risk, and they were prosecuted. So
Absolutely.
For businesses to make sure they're doing the right thing, not just morally, helping their customers, but I think just making sure you're legal is so important.
A lot of information to go through there, and a lot for people to digest. And now you produced some slides, Sterling, have you, as a little bit of a recap on kind of your 5 steps to managing food fraud. So let's bring those up, if you may. This
is a conversation, not a presentation. This, guys, is because as I get older, my memory's not so good, and I just want to make sure. So even before the 5 simple steps, I think the first thing is to recognize that food fraud is an issue, and it's not something that just is happens somewhere out in the rest of the world, and the big organizations are affected. It can affect your business no matter how big or small. So at some point in your food safety management system, however complicated or robust or not it is, put food fraud in there. This is a risk that needs to be addressed. And the 5 simple things for me is map out your supply network. Now, if you're one of the big manufacturers, it'll be very, very, very complicated, as you can imagine. But you have to know where your food is coming from, and you have to have traceability of it. So you understand your supply chain, and that could be, as I say, if you've got a small restaurant, who is your suppliers and what do they supply? So you've got to scope out, well, what's coming into my organization. And I say it can be as complicated or simple depending on what the risk is. I mean, if it's a really big risk, you have to do it, and the size of your organization. And next slide, please. And then you've got to identify the risks. And this is a pretty kind of obvious stuff, and I try to keep it really, really simple. which is right. Once you've got all this information, what are you going to do for it? Well, some things might present a big risk and some things not. So you might think, my meat, where I'm getting my meat from, like my big protein foods, like fish, is a very common thing that is that you see fraud around, where you think you're buying one species but getting something else. You might be buying cod and getting coulis or something like that. So you need to be sure that the risks are, well, fish, meat, eggs, milk. They might be an area that you have to have a particular hazard, and especially if I'm not using a big network, I'm using Joe Boggs who turns up on a van. So be careful about how you identify the risk. So you're putting your efforts into the right area. Next step: assess and prioritize the risk. So you'll end up with some risks, but at the end of the day, you will think, well, these one or two things, if you're small, could be more than that if you're huge, are the ones I've really got to focus on. This has got a highly likelihood of happening, and the hazard of it going wrong is high as well. So if I get this wrong, I could kill someone, and it's not unlikely that I could get it wrong. So that's the things you focus on, rather than the chances of it happening are so rare. And look, even if it happened, it's not going to have a big health impact or business impact. So it's about focusing on the right things. Next slide. And then you have to create an implementation plan. So once you've done it, well, what steps are you going to take? And these are the type of things that trading standards officers and EHOs love to hear when you're doing, big, small businesses. Have you identified the big things you need to control? And once you've identified them, what you're going to do about it. A good example might be Subway's had 2 prosecutions last week, where their franchisees did a lot of this. As you imagine, being a Subway franchisees, we're one of the biggest organizations in the world, one of the most sophisticated, did all this that Subway requested, got a pest control contractor in that Subway can you have to have and HACCP and all that type of thing. But they created an implementation plan, but they didn't do anything. And so one of the reasons they were prosecuted is their pest control contractor said to them, you have to do A, B, and C to make sure you're safe, and they just ignored it. So don't be one of those businesses that does the first step but doesn't actually have a plan. And then lastly, as you can imagine, is track, review, and communicate. So if you've identified these risks, just make sure that you don't think, well, that's the job done, I've created my paper. When the head office comes down, or if an EHO or TSO comes through the door, I've got the paper to show them, and that will keep them happy. What people are looking for, what you need to do as a business owner, is to make sure that you're checking in regularly. So this isn't like a driving license. Here, Kelvin, here's your driving license. I'll see you when you're 70. So I've got to reset my driving license. I think when I'm 70, I've got to redo the test in 4 years. It's more like an MOT, which is, Kelvin, you're driving an old banger. It's over 3 years old, and every year I want to check that your banger is still okay. And it's that mentality to get into MOT. I've done it. I'm checking it day to day anyway. I'll put some checks in, but once a year I'm going to pick that up, or maybe more often you've got big risks, and think, well, am I doing what I should be doing? And then lastly, I suppose this is my advert. LGC stands for the Laboratory of the Government Chemist. As I say, I chair the Food Authenticity Network, which was set up after the horse meat scandal. It's free, guys. It's a free network, open access. You can become a member by just see this QR code here, or you can go to the website. You can join for free, and you'll find a lot of the things I'm talking about there. So rather than go to hundreds of sites, on one site, you can get all this information. And of course, also Safe to Trade. A lot of the information is on Safe to Trade, where what I like is there's lots of links there. So if people need more information, it's a really easy site to go to say, oh, there's my link to the FSA, FSS. Here's my tool site. Here's my whatever it is on food safety. I think it's really a great signposting site that you can trust.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sterling. I'm conscious of time, so let us throw over to some of our live viewers and see if we've got some questions. There's actually quite a good conversation going in our chat panel between all of the people having a chat with each other. So I'm actually just looking to see if we have an actual question for us. Here we go. We've got a question from Mayowa. Thank you very much for your question. And they're asking, is price differential really an indication of food frauds? The pricing of some food products in major supermarkets might just be higher than other competitors.
No, but it is an indicator. But I think the retail industry, if you're talking about supermarkets, is very, very, very competitive. And so the people are always trying to undercut each other on price. And I know that if I go to, just pick them off the top of my head, if I go to an Aldi, normally it's the cheapest you can get. And in fact, a lot of other supermarkets, when I go into my Sainsbury's, it says price match with Aldi, as I do when I go into Tesco, the same thing. So I think people accept it's a low price supermarket, but whether it's the same product is difficult. Is it the same as the brand? Some of I'm going to go at Aldi, I'm a regular shopper, but a lot of their products look like the brand, but it doesn't mean that they are the same quality as the brand, which is what the brands and other supermarkets say. But that's a good question. But price is a good indicator.
Interesting.
You are trying to, if you're a food fraudster, it's difficult to sell through a big supermarket because they've got so many stops and checks, and sell for big food manufacturers or big caterers, like if you're in Compass or something like that. It's difficult to do that, but with a medium and small micro business, it's a bit easier to say, look at this price. You can get some fantastic offers, but there's a cost.
Indeed. And kind of sticking with retail and brand, we've got a question from Kevin McGarry. Thank you for your question, Kevin. We're saying to avoid adulteration, is it better to stick to mainstream brands, or is there a risk here? So, if you're having your olive oil, do you get Bertolli?
I think it is consumer choice. And if I'm not a poor person and I can afford to go shop at Tesco's, or I go to Aldi across the road. I go to Aldi and I go to M&S across the road, and I mix and match. So everyone wants good value. So I think, and I go to marketplaces as well because I like food farm shops, and there's a guy that turns up with a van with fresh fish from Whitby, and I have an interesting conversation with him. So I think it's about making people have a choice. And the vast majority of these businesses, like we talk about food manufacturing, employing 400,000 people, the vast majority are small businesses. They're not the big brands. Retailing, 80% is 4 people. And I think that's in catering. Catering employs 3 million people, hospitality, 3 million. And you do have your big compasses and people like that, but the vast majority are small people, small shops. And so I know the point that he's making. Now you want trust, and brands do give you a trust, but as well as going to a Costa, there's a local coffee shop here I go to, or my fish and chip shop, or my local Chinese restaurant, who aren't big brands. So I think it's being sensible about, as I say, if it's got a strange feeling, you think, well, that's amazing value. Maybe there's a reason why.
Indeed. There's some really interesting comments that are made as opposed to questions. Paul Turner, hi Paul, thank you for joining us today. Paul is saying that pubs and clubs are having their glass recycling raided for genuine branded bottles that are then filled with cheaper versions of the branding drinks. From my time in the licensed trade, I believe that's known as passing off when you're substituting your brands there. So it's a huge area that is training standards, licensing, environmental health. It kind of covers the world of enforcement. So yes, some particular horror stories that you hear out there in the media.
Great to hear, Paul, and that is not uncommon. I think the funny one recently was Scottish tea. Did you hear about that? Somebody was selling Scottish tea grown in Scotland, to Harrods and all the big brands. So you think, if I'm going to Harrods, I think it was Fortnum and Masons, well, what more can you have for assurance? And I'm surprised they don't grow tea in Scotland. And he was importing it from India and sticking, this is Scottish tea and its sustainability is great because it's not traveled around the world. And so even though you can buy a big brand, you can still get caught out. Scottish tea, who'd have thought you could get tea grown in Scotland? That in itself would have been a bit of an indicator.
Indeed. Question from Anthony Rock. Thank you, Anthony. Anthony's asking, is there another body that we should be reporting such to, or is it just a matter of contacting the local EHO? I don't know if Anthony's coming at this from a general consumer perspective or as a food business operator who may find themselves in a chain they don't want to be in. But yeah, where do we report food fraud?
So if he's thinking about something he believes is illegal as a consumer, well, then the great place to report it is the Food Standards Agency or Food Standards Scotland, who have a line, a telephone line. So if you go to their website, there's a whistleblower line. So if you're a consumer and think, I think something's going wrong there, you can report it directly to them or to your local authority, TSOs or EHOs, because most people don't know what the difference is between them. It's another acronym to them. All they know is someone in the local authority must be going in here and dealing with this type of thing. And sometimes people phone up the police even if they genuinely think there's a food crime. So there are lots of points that you will go to, and it ends up with a person that's most appropriate. So it'll either be the TSO, who've done some great work here locally in prosecuting someone that was passing off salmonella certificates as real when they weren't. So it could be a TSO picking it up, or it could be a bigger level organised crime. Food standards. If he's talking about where do I go for help, just generally as a business, as I say, there's Food Authenticity Network are great. There's the Food and Drink Federation. There's UK Hospitality. There's Safe to Trade, obviously. There are lots of organisations out there, sites you can go to and report something you think is wrong. In fact, I think, isn't it part of the Safe to Trade system? There is a QR code on there, isn't there?
Indeed, yeah. We were talking about that last month, Sterling, with the launch of the health and safety scheme as well. Consumer feedback is such a huge part of Safe to Trade, and if consumers have got concerns about a business that is listed on the Safe to Trade public register or displaying their Safe to Trade logo, then they provide that feedback to us and it is evaluated. Businesses with ongoing, substantial, persistent and genuine negative feedback, we investigate and we could downgrade them and remove them from the scheme if they don't deserve to be there. So obviously that is all aspects of the scheme in itself, but from a food fraud perspective, if you were not served the food that you think you have ordered and you have concerns, give us the feedback and we investigate. And this is the power to the public of businesses being included in Safe to Trade as a scheme.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's all we've got time for, Sterling. So thank you very much, certainly to you for joining me today. I really appreciate your time. Thank you to everyone who's on our virtual panel. I know you've been just as excited talking to each other as you have today to us. There's been some really interesting chats, so it's almost a networking event here today. So thank you very much to everybody who joined.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. Thanks everyone. Guys, I don't know if we have the facility, but if there are some burning questions that people have got, I don't know, can they email them through and then we'll do our best to answer as many as we can.
Absolutely.
And maybe put it on the
our marketing team will take command as we kind of finish and wrap up the call here today. If there's anything that you want to continue asking in the chat, you want to post comments on the YouTube channel when the video is posted, we collect all of that in and we can field out the answers as well. And we will add to our literature, our knowledge base and other sources there, or contact you directly. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone. So yeah, thank you to you, Sterling. We look forward to seeing you guys very, very soon for our next session. And yeah, have a fantastic day, everyone. Thanks, Sterling.
My pleasure, Kelvin.